Hello, everyone. We're learning Hilachot Sefirat HaOmer, the laws of Sefirat HaOmer. And to understand this, we have to go into the psukim in the Torah. And they're in Parashat Emor. We read this on the second day of Pesach. It says, Daber b'nei Yisrael b'ramata lehem. Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, Ki tavo el aretz, when you come into the land, asher ani noten lachem, into the land which I'm giving you, uksartem et ketzira, and you will reap its harvest. Vehavetem et ha'omer, and you shall bring the omer, reshit ketzircha el hakohen, which is the beginning of your reaping. So it's the first cutting that you're going to bring to the kohen. Ve'nifet ha'omer, and he shall wave the omer lifnei Hashem, before God, and it'll be so that it will be acceptable for you. Mimachorat haShabbat, from the day after Shabbat, which normally means Shabbat, but here means the day after, not Shabbat, but the day after the Yom Tov, the day after the first day of Pesach. Okay, so Yenifenu HaKohen, the Kohen shall wave it. Okay, then it says, Usfaratem lachem, and you shall count for yourselves mimachorot haShabbat, from the day after Shabbat, again, not meaning Shabbat, but the day after the first day of Pesach. Miyom haviachem et ha'omer hatnufa, sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiyena. And you will bring the omer as a wave offering, and you'll count 7 weeks. Okay? אז מאחת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום, הקרבתם מנחה חדשה להשם. You shall count until the day after the 7th week, which is the 50th day, on which you shall bring a new meal offering to Hashem. Now, again, there's many questions on these first 4 psukim. One question can be 7 weeks. 7 times 7 is 49. 49 is not 50. So are you counting 50 days? Or are you counting 7 weeks? Doesn't seem to be the same. And also, last time I checked, the day after Shabbat is normally Sunday. Why are we making this? Why am I forcing myself to say that the day after Shabbat is not the day after Shabbat, but it's the day after the holiday of Pesach? So we have to answer those questions. And in there, again, it says, we read this on the 8th day of Pesach in Parashat Re'eh. It says, Shiva Shavuot tispor lach, you shall count 7 weeks for yourselves. Mehachel cheremesh bakama, from when the sickle is first put to the standing crop. Tachel lispor shiva shua, you shall begin to count 7 weeks. And Rashi explains here, from when the sickle is first put to the standing crop, Mehachel cheremesh bakama, Misheniktzar HaOmer Shehu Reshit HaKetzir, when the Omer is harvested, which is the beginning of the harvest. Okay, so according to the Torah, the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer, of counting the Omer, begins the day that the Korban Omer itself, the barley, is brought in the Bet HaMikdash. This day is described by the Torah as Mimachorat HaShabbat, the day after Shabbat, and according to the Gemara, the word Shabbat here was proven by Chazal to refer to the first day of Pesach, and the Omer was thus brought on the next day, which is the 16th day of Nisan. This is in contrast to the Tzidokim, or the Karaites, who interpreted the word Shabbat as referring to Shabbat itself, whether it falls out during Pesach or whenever it falls out on Pesach. The Rambam summarizes the position of Chazal and offers an additional proof based on the Pasuk, which you can have a look here. We're not going to go into it too much. But we do want to understand here that rabbinic tradition, what we call the Perushim or the Pharisees, which is rabbinic Judaism, which is what we follow today, the understanding was Mimachorat HaShabbat is the day after the first day of Pesach. Whereas the Tzedokim, the Sadducees, they understood it differently. They understood it as the day after Shabbat, and they would always push it off because they wanted to manipulate the calendar for their own purposes. So he says here in the summary, according to Harambam, one can prove that Chazal were correct. Why? Because the verse in Yeshua states that the Jewish people, shortly after entering the land, ate the new grain, which is permitted on the day that the Korban Omer was brought, on the day after the first day of Pesach. Now, if the Korban Omer is brought on the day after Shabbat, according to the Tzidokim, then it is illogical for the pasuk to refer to the first day of Pesach, since that would change every year depending on which date on the calendar Shabbat falls out. Rather, it stands to reason that it is dependent upon a specific calendar date that is referred to as Shabbat, and the first day of Pesach seems to be the most logical. Now, I'm not doing it justice here, going into all these wheres and wherefores, but I will tell you that this is an example, my friends, of where we understand how Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, explains the Bichtav. If I only have the written law, then I would say that Tzidokim, the Sadducees, have a better proof. Mimacharat HaShabbat implies a day after Shabbat, which would be Sunday. But the fact that we have what it says in the Torah and our oral tradition to what it also says in Yeshua, and I connect the two together, there is only one interpretation, which is Mimacharat HaShabbat, in this case means the day after the first day of Pesach. And that's why I'm saying when it comes to understanding Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, we can only do it through the Torah Sheba'al Peh, through our oral tradition. They're not separate Torahs, they go hand in hand. The Shibbolei Haleket gives two different rationales for why we have the mitzvah of counting. And he says it here, I will just do the bold section here, that Bnei Yisrael were very excited because they were told, when you leave Mitzrayim, this is according to the Midrash, you are going to serve Hashem. The word there being ta'avdun. And the word ta'avdun has an extra nun. It could have just said ta'avdu, you shall serve. And the nun at the end of it is, if I look at Gematria, nun is 50, which means that after 50 days, you will receive the Torah. So it says here in the bold, V'Yisrael merov chiba, and out of great love, Israel counted every day, saying one day passed and a second day, and so too with all of them, as it seemed to them to be a long period of time because of their great love for the matter. For this reason, the counting was established to be done for all generations. So not only is it telling us why they counted because they were excited about reaching the Torah, it's telling us why it wasn't 50, 49, 48. If you're excited about something, you count down. It was because to them, it felt like a drag. Oh no, it's another day. Like they were desperate to get to 50. And we want to commemorate that. We want to be like that, that we're excited as we're counting up to Matan Torah. And he says there's another reason here by Rabbi Yehuda HaChasid. And it says, since these were days of labor in the field, and there is no one who will tell the villages whether Iyar is a 29-day month or a 30-day month. Consequently, the Torah says count 50 days, and then for everyone, they don't need to know when it is because they can just count 50 days. They don't need to know when Rosh Chodesh is to decide when the holiday is, and then everyone can celebrate it together. So one is a more practical reason, the other one is a more exciting reason there. But there we go, the two reasons of counting. So we're eagerly accepting Matan Torah, just as our ancestors did after leaving Egypt, while the second reason is a practical one to ensure that even those individuals who would not otherwise know when Rosh Chodesh was due to their being away from the main population would still be able to celebrate the holiday of Shavuot on the proper day. Now, I'm not going to go into it on this shiur, but often people ask, well, if everyone was excited about receiving Matan Torah, why is the Omer period a sad period now? Why are there mourning restrictions such as not getting haircuts or not having weddings? That's for a second time period, which was with Rabbi Akiva's students passing away because they didn't show kavod to one another. And also, much later on, around 1,000 years ago, during the Crusades and other problems and calamities which befell the Ashkenazic populations, So for us, Sephardim, we have two things that we're careful about: haircuts and weddings. A lot of other restrictions which we have with the Omer are mainly of an Ashkenazic origin, which have come in over the last few hundred years, and every generation seems to be stricter and stricter and stricter, and making the Omer period feel like it's Shavua Shechal Bo, the week before Tisha B'Av, which is never the case in the Sephardic communities. We didn't get married, and we didn't have haircuts. But all these other limitations are very much influenced by the Ashkenazic population on us. So just something to bear in mind. Generally, we should be, although it was a sad time because of the death of Rabbi Akiva's students, it's also a period of introspection, but really we should never forget that originally this was an exciting period as you prepare for Matan Torah. Now, is Sefirat HaOmer a Torah level mitzvah or a rabbinic level mitzvah? Well, we just said in the earlier verses that they would bring the Korban Omer. So if it was a Korban brought, we don't have a Bet HaMikdash, so we can't bring the Korban. So that would imply what? There would only be, Midrabanan would only be a rabbinic law. And that's exactly what Tosafot says. Nireh, sorry, so we would say that it is only rabbinic. So if that's the case, the Tosfot says, when it is an uncertainty whether it is yet night, whether it's choshech yet, whether the night has come, one can make the bracha, and one does not need to wait until it's absolute nighttime. Why? Because we're dealing with a rabbinic mitzvah, and therefore a rabbinic mitzvah, if there's a doubt, I can act leniently. Whereas Harambam says, Mitzvat aseh lispor shiva shabbatot miyom havaat haomer. He says it's a positive mitzvah to count 7 complete weeks from the day the Omer is brought. And he writes in Kav Daled, mitzvah zo al kol ish Yisrael, it's on every Jewish male, uvechol makom, uvechol zaman, and it's applicable everywhere and all times, i.e., even though there's no Bet HaMikdash and even though we're outside the land of Israel. Nevertheless, the Beit Yosef rules, that's not Hacham Abadja, that's Rav Yosef Cairo writes in his Beit Yosef, that Sefirat HaOmer Achshav Eno Ela Midarabanan. Even though we say what the Rambam says, he says Sefirat HaOmer is only rabbinic. And therefore, if someone is unsure about whether and we're going to get into this, there's a lot of situations where if someone is in doubt whether they did the mitzvah correctly or not, when it comes to Sefirat HaOmer, we say that if you don't know whether you did it, it's as if you did it. It's only if you know for sure that you didn't do it, then we say you're out of the count. But if you can't remember whether you counted or not, then we say it's as if you counted. Why? Because it's only rabbinic. If it was a Torah level mitzvah, we would say safek. We would say that we would go lechumra, would go strictly. But since we are saying that it is on a rabbinic level, then we'll say it will act leniently and say that you can make the baracha every time. Now, when is the right time or the proper time for counting? The Gemara Menachot Samach Vav says, Miyom habiachem tisperu, from the day that you brought the Omer, it says you shall count. So it says here, Yachol Yitzor v'yavi. One might have thought that although one must harvest and bring the Omer on the 16th of Nisan, that Ematai Sheir Tzevi Yispor, when do you think he would he may start to count from whenever he wants after that day? But Talmud Lomar, the pasuk comes to teach you, Mehachel Chermesh Bakama, Tachel Lispor. The verse states, from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain, you shall begin to number 7 weeks. The pasuk indicates that the counting should commence upon the reaping of the grain for the Omer offering. And it says here, so if one would read just this verse, from the single time the sickle is first put to the standing grain, you shall begin to count. One might think that one can harvest and count and then bring the Omer whenever he wishes. Therefore, the Torah states from the day that you brought, indicating that counting should start on the day the Omer is brought. Now, carrying on with that rationale, so therefore you might think, if that's the case, I should start counting when? During the day. Talmud lomar, sheva shabbatot timot tihena, ematar ata motzeh sheva shabbatot timimot, bisman she'ata matchil limnot mi'ba'erev. Well, here's a problem. If you count during the day, you won't get to have 7 full weeks. And so therefore, in order to get 7 full weeks, when do you count? You count from the night before. And that's how it begins. As we all know, we count the second night of Pesach. It's not the second day of Pesach, it's the second night. Okay, so we begin so for example, first night of Pesach was Motzei Shabbat. We started counting on Sunday night. We didn't wait till Monday morning. So it says here, Belel Sheni, on the second night, says Shulchan Aruch, Achar Tefilat Arvit, after evening prayers, Matchilin Lispor HaOmer, we begin to count the Omer. Vim Shachach Lispor B'tchilat HaLayla, and if one forgot to count at the beginning of the night, one can continue and count all night long. The Be'or Halacha here notes that one need not count the Omer immediately after it gets dark, before saying Arvit. Rather, Arvit is usually recited before counting the Omer. Why? Because we have a concept normally of Tadir, Ushe'eno Tadir. When you have one thing which is less frequent than the other, the thing which is more frequent goes first. And we say Arvit every day, every night, but we only count the Omer between Pesach and Shavuot. And so therefore, that's the reason why we say Arvit and then count the Omer. Okay? Shehut Tadir, because it is more frequent. Harav Yosef Tzri Rimon says, well, what about if you're going to pray at a late minyan? Should I count the Omer first there and then say Arvit? He says, no, also there we go by the rationale of Tadir ve'eno Tadir. Tadir kodem, whenever you have these two things, one is more frequent than the other, we do the more frequent one first. Okay? Now, what about, and this is something which we do at Sephardic Bikur Cholim, when can you count? Do I have to wait till 3 stars come out when Shabbat ends, or can I count sometime after sunset? Okay, and as you probably know from the fact that SBH does Arvit after sunset and then counts it probably 15, 20 minutes later, you know that this is something that you can do. So Mishnah Berurah here says, Min hadin, strictly speaking, efshar lahakel, one can be lenient, lispor mishet tachshach, from the moment that the sun sets, af kodem tzat hakochavim, even before nightfall. The bein hashmashot hu safek laila. Why? Because the time between sunset and nightfall is considered doubtful night. And we go leniently. Since counting the Omer is only rabbinic in nature, we can be lenient. Since the majority of poskim hold it's only rabbinic. Nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah says, this is not the right thing to do, and therefore it's better lechatchila not to do so. That's the Ashkenazic approach. But Hacham Ovadia Yosef writes in Yechavet Da'at, shemitzvah de Raman hutar la'asota beben hashmashot. Since it's rabbinic mitzvah, it is permissible to do it between sunset and nightfall because of the reason of safek d'Rabbanan l'kula. When in case of rabbinic doubt, we go leniently. Havale hasafek kavadai. We consider the safek like a rabbinic certainty. V'reshaim levarech aleha. And one is permitted to bless about this in this way. So rather than saying this is something which you can do b'diavad after the fact, he implies that this is something that you can do, what? Not b'diavad, but lechatchila, in an ideal way of doing so. And therefore he says, aval kol od shelo shak'a hachama, but if the sun has not yet set, ein nispor HaOmer b'racha b'shum panim. Well, obviously, if it's not yet sunset, the sun is still up, there's still a little bit, therefore one is not allowed to do that. Afilu be'erev Shabbat, even on Friday night, after Kabbalat Shabbat, when you brought in Shabbat early, one cannot count before sunset. Now, the practice, which I was surprised he didn't bring down there, is the Hacham of Haji Yosef says to wait 13 and a half minutes. And you might ask, why 13 and a half minutes after sunset? 13 and a half minutes, and this is what we go by in SBH, this is the time where anything before 13 and a half minutes, I could say it's the previous day. But anything after 13 and a half minutes, I'm no longer in that no man's land, whether is it yesterday or is it already tomorrow. So once it's 13 and a half minutes, I can 100% count the Omer. Not b'diavad, but lechatchila. And that's the way that we do it at SBH. Now we're going to get into these situations where people are always texting me or asking, Rabbi, I didn't count. Or the converse, I know for sure I did not count. Or perhaps even, I don't know if I counted. What happens in those situations? So we'll do the straightforward one. One who did not count at night. So it says here in the Beit Yosef, Katav Baal Halachat Gadolot. Im shachach, if one forgot levarech kol halayla, and he didn't make the bracha all night, yispor bayom, he can count during the day. Ken katuva Tosfot beperek Rabbi Yishmael b'shmo. Okay, and that's the Tosfot brings that down too. V'katvu sheken nireh b'tnan b'mitzvato b'layla liktzor, and we learn that out from the Gemara Menachot, the mitzvah of the nighttime to do so. Okay. V'im niktzah bayom kasher. So there was the mitzvah to harvest the barley for the Omer at night, but if you did it during the day, it was still kasher. Aval nireh Rabbeinu Tam, but it seems to Rabbeinu Tam, Ika idach stama, the perek shein de Megillah, kol halayla kasher lektsirat HaOmer. V'dakina mina the katane layla dumya diyom, ma diyom balayla lo, af delayla bayom lo. But the Beit Yosef says, the Baal Halachot Gadolot says at the top there, one should count during the day if one forgot at night. But Rabbeinu Tam says that they performed at night may not be performed during the day. So should we follow like Rabbeinu Tam, or do we follow like the Bahag? And the majority of the Rishonim do hold like the Bahag, the Baal Halachot Gadolot, including the Rosh, the Ran, and the Mordechai. And they would hold that you could even make the Beracha during the day. But that's not what we do. Maran Shulchan Aruch brings a compromise. You can count during the day if you miss during the night, just you don't make a Beracha. So he says here in Shulchan Aruch, and this is the get out of jail free card. Shachach, if one forgot, velo berach kol halayla, and one did not make the bracha all night, yispor bayom, you do count on the day, however, below beracha, without making a beracha. Okay? And therefore, mihu mikanul haba, Mishnah Berurah adds, however, from here onwards, Sofer bechol halayla bivracha, you can then continue the next night counting with a bracha, v'lo haveh, and it's not considered kedileg yom achad legamre, like you could missed out one whole day completely. She'eno sofer or bibracha, because if you knew with certainty that you missed a night and the following day, then we would say, then you're out for counting with a bracha. And Yakut Yosef says the same thing. And he brings down, and this is something we do at SPH, Minhag Nachon BeYerushalayim. This is a great custom in Jerusalem. Lispor HaOmer B'Veit HaKnesset, to count the Omer in the synagogue, B'Shachrit, in the morning, B'li bracha, without a bracha, and we do this right before Pitum HaKetoret. She'im yesh mi sheshachach, so if there is someone who forgot Lispor by to count at night, Yispor B'Shachrit, he'll count in the morning, V'yo'illo, and it'll help him, Shemikan haba Yispor B'Bracha, because from here on, he can continue to count with a bracha. But if you missed an entire day, says Tosfot, Obsak behilchot gadol, the Bahag says further, Im hifsik yom echad belo sipeh, if you missed a whole day without counting, shuv eino sofer, one does not count, and you can add here with a bracha in parentheses. Mishum debaya timimu, because we require full or complete. V'tema gadolahi. But this opinion is a great astonishment. Why? Why is this a great astonishment and it's not possible? The Chinuch attempts to explain the logic of the Bahag, though he does not quote him by name, as being that the entire count of 49 days is considered one mitzvah. Thus, when one misses one day, the count is not complete. But he too agrees that he should not be the halacha. He says here, and some say the one who forgot and did not count one day may not count any more days that year, since they are all one mitzvah. And since he forgot one day, the entire count has been nullified. But our teacher in our generation did not accept this logic. Rather, one who forgot one day should say, yesterday it was X, without a beracha, and then count on the rest of the days with the entire Jewish people. Most other Rishonim also reject the Bahag, including the Ri, cited by the Rosh, who explain the reason for the opposing approach. And they write, but this does not make sense to the Ri, since every night is a separate mitzvah. As opposed to the Bahag, who seems to have held that the entire Sefirat count as one mitzvah, the Ri explains that the count each day is a separate mitzvah, or may fulfill the rest of the count even if one day was missed. The Trumat Hadeshen brings a compromise, and he says if one definitely did not count for the entire day, you may no longer count with a bracha. That's in deference to the Bahag, but he should count just without a bracha. And if he is unsure if he forgot or not, again, there we go into the situation of doubt. We say he can continue with a bracha. Why? Because we said before, because this is a rabbinic mitzvah. Since it's rabbinic, then we can do so. So here we see this compromise shita, the Trumat Hadeshen. If one is unsure if he counted one night or not, what should he do? It says it seems they should count with a bracha from that point onward, even if he did not remember about the doubt until the next night. Even so, he may count with a bracha due to the doubt. And even though if one certainly forgot one day, we follow the Bahag, who writes that if he forgot one day, he may no longer count. Nevertheless, this means with a bracha, but one may still count without. And the Shulchan Aruch rules like the Trumat Hadeshen, and it follows, Im shachach levarech bechad mehayamim, if one forgot to count on one of the days, bein yom rishon, bein shayamim, whether it was on the first day, or whether it was on the later days, sofer b'shayamim b'lo bracha, he counts the remaining days without a bracha. Aval imhu mesupak, but if he's in doubt, in dileg yom echad, if he skipped one day, velosi penny didn't count, he's just down, he doesn't know, he can't remember. Yispor b'shayam in bracha, he should continue counting the days with a bracha. The Mishnah Brura says, Hu hadin im noda lo she'etmol ta'a b'minyan v'siper sefira acheret dino kamo shelo siper klal. If one forgot to recite the bracha, the same applies if he found out that he erred, he made the wrong count, and he counted a different count. The halacha is the same as one who did not count at all. And the proper thing to do is to hear the bracha from the chazan or from the people reciting the bracha, and answer amen with intent to fulfill the mitzvah and then count. And then he continues, and he may count the rest of the days with the bracha. Why? Since there is a double uncertainty. Perhaps he didn't skip at all, and if you say that he did skip, perhaps the halacha is in accordance with those poskim that every day is a separate mitzvah, and so therefore we allow him to count with a bracha in the case of doubt. Now, if one forgot to count at night as well as the next day, but only remembered during Ben Hashmashot, this period between sunset and nightfall, may he still continue at that time and then continue counting during the rest of Sefirat with a bracha. This is a machloket achronim. This is a disagreement amongst the later deciders. According to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one may not continue counting with a bracha. You can see that there in source 36, whereas Hacham Avadia Yosef's son quotes him, another poskim, that one may continue to count with a bracha in this case too, and we can see that here in source 27. And so therefore, you can see the Sephardic approach is to be more lenient once again in this scenario. Again, because of the concept of, number one, it's a safek, because it's only rabbinic mitzvah, so we can go lekula, and also the discussion whether each and every day is a separate mitzvah or not. And so therefore, we can add that double doubt to say that you should continue with a bracha. Although, as we have seen, there is sometimes room to continue to count the Omer with a bracha, even when one forgot to count at night, the Chida in his sefer known as Avodat HaKodesh writes that in general, one should be careful not to forget Sefirat HaOmer, because if he misses an entire day, his berachot recited until that point on the previous nights might be considered to have been in vain retroactively. Okay, and this is something to be careful about, and therefore he says, Yizdarez v'yaseh simanim. One should exert oneself and make reminders that one not forget one night when one is not counting with the congregation, because it is possible that one will forget during the day as well, and one will not be able to count with the beracha anymore. Then all of the berachot from previous nights will be retroactively in vain. Clearly you can see here that the Chida held that it was one mitzvah all 50 days rather than each day was a mitzvah. So therefore he said you should be careful, and here's where Omer counters and all the like came from this concern. Nevertheless, even if one knows that he will not be able to complete Sefirat, it is permitted for him to count with a bracha until that time. That's the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Halichot Shlomo. It is permitted for him to begin counting with a bracha as long as he is able, even if there is a concern that he may forget. And this is not related to the idea of placing oneself in a situation of making a bracha levatala. Why? Since he's currently doing what he is supposed to do. And perhaps the situation will change. Perhaps he will be a person who can remember each night. So we can't say, I'm definitely going to forget later, and therefore I shouldn't count. Because it's natural to say that he will do better. Okay, this is an excellent point to stop, and because we're going to have mincha in a few minutes, so let's stop here, and we'll continue next time by looking at Sefirat HaOmer for women and other scenarios. Okay, so we'll have a look at that next time.